All right. And we are live. Hi, guys. Welcome back to the channel. Today, we are going to have a conversation with James. And James has a channel called Modern Day Hysteria. And he's, I guess, the opposite side to my coin. He's a Christian who studies psychology. So this will be exciting. I'm really looking forward to the conversation. So James approached me and wanted to have a discussion after watching the video that I had put out on I believe it was the video on the myth of the unhappy atheist, and he went through some of the research and approached me about it, and we thought that this would be an interesting discussion to have live on air so that everybody could see. So I'll give James a chance to introduce himself, and his link for his channel is in the description. If anybody wants to check it out, I suggest that you do. James is a good guy. So everybody say hi to James, and James, say hi to everybody.
Hello, I'm very excited to be here. I'm really excited about a couple of things. So one is the original video, and within just the last hour, I actually made a video that I published that basically gave you a high five because for real, I liked that both, or I don't like the fact that both Christians and atheists, on average, most videos don't use primary or peer-reviewed sources.
Right.
So whenever I do find a video on either side that is actually using peer-reviewed sources, I'm like, oh, this is great. Like, because it's like now with Google Scholar, having peer-reviewed journals available is a really neat thing. And so anyway, when I saw your video, it just kind of lit up. I was like, oh my gosh, like, look, you're kind of saying, hey, here's the empirical data. And I actually thought there were a lot of great points. I think that we agree on almost everything. In fact, I think there's nothing we really disagree on as much as maybe there's something that a pattern I thought that I noticed in the papers. But with that, I'm also happy that Shannon, that you're a social person. You're very friendly, and I'm not so like it's true that my channel is it definitely attacks a lot of atheist claims. The good news is I think a lot of times I go after the low-hanging fruit. So a lot of the claims that I'm attacking on the channel, a lot of you atheists who might be listening would say, well, it doesn't bother me. I don't make that claim anyway. Right. And that's great. I would also, this is something that I'm trying to do because I'm trying to, you could say, foster a more balanced channel. Okay. One is I like the video I just put out within, hopefully if it's not showing on my channel now, let me know, because I just put it out in the last hour, basically giving praise to your channel or your video in particular, because it's using peer-reviewed sources. And I think you did a good job of actually talking about what's in the papers. You didn't just give sources, but you actually explained the concepts. Right. And then the second thing is I just made a video where I'm trying to say, okay, what arguments are Christians using that they should probably stop using? Right. Because there are arguments that I would concede that Christians use, or it's like, and I don't want to be unfair, because not all Christians use these arguments. Yeah. Some Christians use some lousy arguments that are just like, well, that's just factually, we know that's false. Right. And that's obviously a bad thing no matter whose side. So, but yeah, so we can get to the papers though. So let me, first just talk about the things that I love that, I'm really glad I could have you here to tell me all the things that you love. We'll just stop there. Good night, everybody. Yeah, that's been fun. And it's like I really learned things because I've like read this like stuff for a while, and when I had read and seen the part basically about the relationship between belief certainty, it's an idea that I had heard, but I hadn't seen like a cumulative type case for this. Yeah, where you had a fair point. Sorry to interrupt you, but you did have a fair point, because I referenced it very briefly in the video towards the end. I said there's also, I always make a point of saying, this is the thing about especially, psychological research, because you study psychology as well, is, we're always finding more, and we have to use hypothetical constructs, and it's a lot more difficult in our field to, constrain and quantify variables than it is in a lot of other fields. So, and it's much more multifaceted than just, controlling for physical compounds, right? So I always make a point of saying, this is what we see now, and we can
look at trends and make some predictions and make some extrapolations, but keep in mind, there could be more. We're always learning more. And so I did reference the part of the study where they said that belief certainty seemed to be affiliated in a relatively strong way, but it was correlational data with positive outcomes on I think they used a Likert type scale to measure your happiness, your overall like life satisfaction.
Yeah.
So just to give everybody a little bit of baseline in case they haven't seen the video, I did reference it briefly, but I didn't extrapolate on it enough just solely for time constraints. So I'm really glad that you approached me because it's an interesting topic to delve into more. So I'll throw it back to you. I just wanted to give a little bit of background just so that people would know where we're coming from. So,
yeah.
Sorry to interrupt you.
No, I'm glad you brought that up because it makes me think of a point that I'd like to bring up because you maybe have run into skeptics of your video or studies that you cited who might say, well, that's just self-report and that's not good science, but that's not true. And the reason is though self-report is far from perfect, it does have some sort of bias to it, regardless of who's filling it out, by the way. It doesn't matter if they're atheists or Christians, but we do have good reasons, good scientific reasons. I'm only going to say this because I think you'll find it interesting. My guess is people that you guys like science and I do too. So maybe you'll get a kick out of the fact that one way in which we know that self-reports are actually pretty useful as you could say a research method is that we see that they're corroborated or correlate strongly with how other people rate a person on happiness. So for example, if you say, well, how good are our self-report measurements? We can actually say, okay, what we'll do is, let's say theoretically, we have a bunch of people who rate themselves on their own happiness. And then what we're going to do is we're going to see if, theoretically, Bob says that he's an 8 out of 10 on happiness.
Yeah.
Well, what does his wife say he is? Because those should correlate. Namely, that if Bob is really a happy person, if his self-report is honest, then his wife should probably say that Bob is maybe somewhere between a 7 and a 9.
Yeah.
But if his wife said, if you found that the participants' spouses said something like, no, I think they're quite different than that, that would obviously be a bad sign. But if they correlate strongly, that's a good sign. And that's what we do find for self-report. So that's just one small corroborating evidence that self-report, though far from perfect, is useful. And there's other ones too, but I don't want to get too bogged down in it. So
yeah. let's talk about research methodology. I love research methodology. Nobody else is probably going to be.
Oh yeah, sorry that was boring. I just thought it was.
I love it.
Yeah,
I know there's a certain degree of observer bias, and there's going to be a certain, and these are things that constrain us as psychology. Like there's a certain degree of observer bias always, right? So because that somebody is reading the data, they're like, obviously you have a mind and you're going to think while you're filling something out. Some people will be honest, some people will over exaggerate so there's a certain degree of that. But when you see consistent trends too, because it's not the same people also. So when you see certain demographics, not even just the corroboration, but if you see those trends throughout, different geographical regions, for example, but the breakdown is consistently similar and there's some overlap, that gives it a certain degree of statistical validity as well.
Yeah.
So just to say that.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I agree. So it's to get to the papers, because I sidetracked.
No, don't apologize to me. I love methodology. Methodology is important.
That's good. So belief certainty, there is evidence, definitely. And it makes sense, right? That if you have more certainty about the way the world works in the big picture, that does make sense that you'd have less anxiety about the world. Because if you think that you could say you've got it figured out, generally speaking, you have it figured out a little bit more, you might think that it's more predictable. And there's definitely something about that people feel more comfortable in more predictable or familiar circumstances. And so if you think you have an idea of the way things are, and then that's another thing too, is like terror management theory in psychology is the idea that like we have this like deep subconscious fear of death, and that plagues us, and there's actually, like, it sounds bizarre, but there's actually good evidence for it. So regardless of whether or not you're religious or an atheist, let's say, and by that I mean positive atheist. So you take the assertion that there is no God. If you say you have certainty about what's coming in the afterlife, that might give you some sort of comfort in terms of, well, once you actually start believing you know what it's going to be like when you die, then, or maybe won't be like if you think that there's no afterlife, then you can at least right now start psychologically dealing with it.
Sure.
And kind of working through, coming to a, you could say like a mindset of acceptance in which you feel more comfortable with it. So anyway, I agree with that. There's good data there.
There's
And then I also
good,
agree with this. Go ahead, sorry.
I was just going to say there's also relatively decent data that shows that having a degree of uncertainty in general in any principle of your life gives you less confidence and causes you internal turmoil, right? So if because you're constantly trying to we like stasis, right? We strive for a state of stasis. There's good evidence for that. So if you have, especially on something that's as an intrinsic as an overall belief system, if you're, if you put yourself all the way over to atheist and then all the way over to true believer, there's a spectrum in the middle. And there seems to be evidence based on the studies that you and I have been reading back and forth that as you get farther away from those poles, that uncertainty seems to play a role. Now, I just recently read through a lot of research on group identity theory, which was really, really interesting. And I think that there might be a little bit of an overlap there too, because we all like to be a part of a cohesive group, and that forms a good portion of our identities.
Yeah.
The groups that we align ourselves with. So if you feel that you're not necessarily aligned with a cohesive group, that could play a role as well. And I don't want to go too far off base, but I think it's more multifaceted than just saying I'm certain about this, therefore I can plan my life because I'm certain about this component. I think that, there's a degree of social fixation, like if you're less individuated from a large group, if you have a more cohesive group, then obviously that's going to give you a larger degree of satisfaction. If you're a religious person, you have a built-in group, for example, right? You have a built-in social strata that you can, work up or down or find your place in. If you're an atheist, it's more difficult to find this. Anyway, I'm going off on a tangent because I just read a bunch of other studies, so I'm sorry, but I love this. Go ahead.
No, that's good. That I had read something similar to that. There's a paper, I think it's by Lim and Putnam. One of them's from Harvard, one of them's from, I think, University of Wisconsin, and they talk about the religious identity that people have through churches. And so they try to compare, like, basically they talk about that, you could say, as being like so we should think of religiosity as like you could say a multi-dimensional construct. And that's just what I mean. By construct, I mean, it's something that, and I know you probably know this, you probably remember this, but for those who might be new to it, like a construct would be something that we can't empirically directly measure, but we can measure, you might say, behaviors or subcomponents of the construct. So for example, one example that maybe we're more familiar with in terms of thinking of a construct is depression. And then we can measure different components of depression. So one might be like difficulty with sleep, like a normal sleep pattern. Another one might be like feelings of sadness or worthlessness. And so those are different subcomponents of the broader construct of depression. Religion's similar, that religion is a broad thing that you can't, religiosity is a broad thing you can't directly measure in like some sort of singular sense, but you can measure subcomponents of it. And one component, of course, would be like religious beliefs, like how many religious beliefs do you have, how strong are they? And that's what the data in these papers in terms of belief certainty talk about. You could also measure, though, the other variable you just mentioned is like degree of involvement with religious groups. That would be another one. How often you go to church, something like that. And then another one might be like religious behaviors, like personal religious behaviors, like prayer, reading scripture, things like that. And that's where we will finally get to the point of, like, you could say, where I'm noticing a trend in these papers in the review is that if they look at belief certainty, you see like a pretty even U-shape in terms of happiness. You see that people who are very firm in their belief that there's no God, and those who are very firm in the belief that there is a God, they're on the outer ends of this kind of U-shape, where they're like, yeah, we're about the same, and we both happen to be happier than people who are unsure. And by the way, which is really interesting, they find the exact same thing in politics, is that
oh, interesting, if you're polarized right or left.
Yeah.
Just okay,
Yeah.
sure.
So
Sorry.
like extremist liberals and extremist conservatives, they're the happiest people. They're actually, surprisingly, you wouldn't think so, but they're actually they're pretty darn happy. And then people who are like, I'm political moderate, I'm not sure, on average, they're not as happy. And remember, there's always exceptions. So this is just the general trend. But when we look at religious certainty, one thing we have to consider in terms of measuring religiosity, I would say, is not just belief certainty, because there's other components. And when you look at if a person's doing a lot of religious behaviors, you might have a reason to believe, because there is like empirical data, there are actual true experiments that do show that some religious behaviors do make people more happy. Now, like I said, it wouldn't follow that therefore the religious would be more happy from that alone, because it could be that atheists find their own behaviors they do that make them happy instead of religious behaviors.
Like, for example, if they're introspective behaviors, there's studies that show that praying, for example, is, at baseline pretty close to just meditation, because they're both introspective behaviors. I should see if I can find that study for you.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
They have the same psychological affect of, relaxation, breath control, envisioning a future, for example, depending on the aspects that you. So yeah, so there's it all depends on the let's see if I wish I could articulate this better, because the study's not fresh in my mind, but it essentially depends on they're measuring the outcome of the action, right? So they're saying if you pray, then X happens. So therefore X is good. So praying is good because praying leads to X. Now, that doesn't tell you why praying leads to X. It just gives you kind of a correlational relationship. Now, you can also see behaviors that could be considered similar, introspective sort of behaviors, like meditation, for example, which you can do without a religious affiliation, that can also lead to the outcome of X. But there is some overlap in the type of psychological aspect. I think it was an MRI study where they would see that there was portions of, was it cortisol levels that went down, dopamine levels went up. I hope I'm not misrepresenting that, but yeah. So anyway, I'm getting off track, but those types of behaviors have sort of could potentially have secular counterparts, but those secular counterparts aren't as frequently employed by people because there's not a structure built around it that calls for that. Does that make sense?
Yes. Okay. Yeah, you read my mind. That was exactly what I was going to say, is that it doesn't.
People aren't raised to meditate.
Yeah. Is that most people, so, you have some people who are strongly religious, and especially if you have a community around you that values the same things, a lot of people don't realize like how influential that is on us.
Yes, massively.
Like, oh yeah. And so if, and religious institutions, they are quite good at making communities that you could say reinforce behaviors. So,
Sure.
By reinforce, I just mean you might have encouragement from friends that say, "Oh, good for you! I'm glad that you're regularly praying," or whatever, something like that.
They become habitual from a young age as well too, and there's something to be said for that.
Oh yeah, that's a good point. And so it's not that secular groups or people couldn't get together and do that. Like they could. You even see like as examples, like maybe not necessarily atheist churches, but maybe just atheist groups that like to get together and talk about this stuff. And it's a sense of community, and it can, but do they as often encourage things like meditation and stuff like that? Like your point was, I think you were kind of saying like, is this being done though, in terms of, you might say, replacement behaviors by non-religious people who say, okay, well, I'm not going to pray, and so maybe I'm not going to get the psychological benefits of prayer through prayer. I'll get those psychological benefits, those same ones, through meditation, but are people doing it as much? And that's why. So this is just this is where it's like really interesting. And the Mahan paper is, you kind of see like, sorry, like
you got the chart. That's perfect. I put it in the description too if anybody wants to open the chart. It's on that paper.
It's really useful because so they measure religion in terms of both belief certainty,
right,
and they also measure the subcomponent of religion, namely religious behaviors. And so like maybe how much do you imbue the normal parts of your everyday life as having religious significance? So that would be one kind of behavior, and we might say that's like a cognitive appraisal of things, spiritually speaking. So like you see that on the far, for me, it's on the left. You'll see that you have atheists there. And so like they're doing better than people down here that we might call nominally religious. By nominal, I mean like some of them might even be like weak in their faith. Like they're like, I don't even know if I believe in this. And then some of them might also be, they're like, well, I mean, I believe it, but it's just like a Christmas and Easter type thing, right?
Yeah.
Which is frankly most Americans, I think.
Cultural Christians.
Yeah. Like, and they're even like, it's hard to say they're even that, because a lot of them don't live consistently with, I mean, a lot of them justify, they try to, I mean, forgive me, I know it sounds preachy because, but I can't help but do it, because it's like, it's one thing for a Christian to be imperfect. Like nobody expects that a Christian is going to consistently live out everything perfectly. But it's another thing if a Christian's like, oh, well, you know what? Like, I never give to charity, but Jesus is okay with that. That's what really irritates me. Okay. So, so like, that's kind of like a lot of Americans though, where they kind of try to adjust it. So anyway, we'll talk about that later. You see,
we've only got another 30 minutes. I don't know if we'll have time. Let's stick to the data for now.
Now, with regard to religious behaviors, these people are probably doing the fewest. And then you see up here, it says adherence. You probably can't read it, sorry. But it says religious adherence. So people that are strongly devoted, they're devout. They're doing prayer regularly. They're going to church every single week. And they do have, it's still a U shape, but you do see this side is higher over here. And that's, I think, what you were saying is that whether or not the behavior is done. Now, here's what's really interesting. This is where I think, for me, like statistics are fascinating, because when you look at it, nonetheless, the fact that Christians are so high up here, or I should say devout Christians, it doesn't necessarily mean that Christians on average are higher. And the reason is, within Christians, you could say the group of Christians in, let's say, at least in the United States, where the research has been done for this paper, I think, right, there's just more variability. And by that, I mean, these groups, namely atheists and Christians, you could still say, it would be true to say, there's no difference between their happiness. And the reason that it's still true is because their averages are still the same. Despite the fact that Christians have this low point and this high point, it averages out to be around the middle, which is about the same as the atheists. So my only point is that it's just like, this is controversial, but I think there's at least probably a little evidence for it, and I'll try to gouge you in terms of. Oh,
I can't wait for this. Let's do it. Let's hear the theory.
Men and women, I do think it's true that they are on average equal intelligence. I do think there's more variability though in terms of men's IQs. So that means I think that men have more people who, a greater proportion of men are mentally retarded as well as genius. And so a lot of people don't like that.
So there's a higher standard deviation between.
So exactly.
Right. Okay. So if we're looking at the bell curve, the standard deviation for the male, like there's a much wider variability because there's more on each end of the spectrum. Whereas if you were looking at the bell curve for a woman, it'd be squished up a little bit with a lower standard deviation, right? So the mean would essentially be the same, potentially even the median or the mode. Well, probably not the mode, but the median would be the same, but there wouldn't be as many outliers to consider. Therefore, so I'm not sure where you're getting with that though. I mean, I understand the way the statistics wash out. I understand how it's measured. So
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, my point.
Go ahead.
Don't worry. I'm not trying to change the conversation into. I'm only saying this is like another example of the same statistical phenomenon. So it's just where two have the same average, and you might say, but how do they have the same average if you're going to claim that men have more geniuses? Which, by the way, that's the part that everybody gets upset about, is that if you say that men have more geniuses, that's where they don't like it. However, I would say, in order to say that the groups are on average equal, you have to say, I think you're kind of compelled to say that men may have more geniuses. And the reason is because nobody really disputes that males do have a greater proportion of those who are cognitively disabled or mentally retarded. The only reason I say that is if you do have men having more people who are mentally retarded, that would bring their average down. The only way that you're going to bring it back up so that they're the same as women is if men also have more geniuses. And so I would say in psychology, nobody really denies the fact. I haven't found anybody, and it seems to be kind of like common knowledge that men do have more special, you might say mentally retarded people. And so unless you want to bite the bullet and say, yeah, they do, and that's why maybe they're a little bit less than women in terms of intelligence on average. Now, like I said, it doesn't mean that like men, it wouldn't be accurate to say men on average are smarter than women. It just means that you're right. The way you put it is that the bell curve for men is more...
It's flatter.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
And so there are those greater amounts of outliers. And religiously speaking, my theory is that it's the same with regard to religion.
Right.
Is that religion has both a higher proportion of miserable people, and it also has a higher proportion of people that are, they're very happy. Okay. That's my theory. And here's one piece
that could potentially be the case, even if I can see that, which I think I'm probably willing to, based on the data that I've been reading. That still leaves the question of why.
Yeah.
Right? That still leaves the question why. And I think that a lot of it has to do, and I mean this is purely speculative. Like at best it's speculative, but I'm starting to get a clearer picture as I read more and more and more. I mean, I've only been reading, just to give you a little bit of my background, my degree, which is there, I have one, is it's in perceptual cognition and communication theory. So
cool.
Right, yeah. So you're industrial organizational, right? IO?
Yes.
Yes.
Now, yeah.
Oh, okay, perfect. I love that. I actually took a course in human factors, which I found really, really fascinating.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. Really like doors of forward pulling or push. Yeah. Anyways, so lost track because I was thinking of human factors for a second. Anyway, so what I was saying was that I think that there's the fact that there's intrinsic communities that are built, ready-made for you to belong to in factor. And it also imbues you with certainty about things because you're told this is the truth, right? So you're told this is a fact, this is the truth, this is what it is, this is who did it, we know. Like, right? Now, if you believe that, that gives you certainty. Now, that's not to say that that certainty is real or accurate. It doesn't make it any less certainty.
Correct.
To you on an individual level, but it also doesn't make it any more true. So I guess the question would be, is it better as a person to have that certainty that makes you happy, even if it's artificial? Like from my perspective, it would be artificial. From yours, it wouldn't be, and I respect that. But from my perspective, it would be artificial certainty. Or is it better to, not have what could potentially be artificial certainty and have to deal with that? Like what's your perspective on that? Like for somebody like me, would it be better for me to try to believe?
That's a great question. So it depends more on philosophy than anything empirical.
Okay.
And so, I mean, it would depend on your philosophy, because there are some who are pragmatists who would argue that, I mean, some of them, there are degrees of pragmatism. So some of them might say like, yep, anywhere, anytime.
Right.
Then there are others that might say maybe in extreme cases. And so they might say, for example, well, if it happens to be the only thing that for some reason is going to pull you out of being suicidal for some reason or another. Now, I'm not saying that that's the only thing that could pull you out of being suicidal. I'm just saying theoretically, if that was the only thing that was going to do it for you in that instant, I think most of us would probably, I think it's really hard to say that you ought not at that point.
Yeah, the gun to your head scenario. I mean, those are really outlying scenarios. Well, here's the coin flip of that question, I guess. So for somebody like me who I couldn't pretend to believe right now, right? I mean, I'm pretty happy overall, but there's many like in my situation who are atheists, and involuntarily so. They're atheists not because they, made a choice not to believe. They could no longer hold that belief. Now, perhaps they're in the realm of uncertainty that, they're not really certain. Maybe the reason I am happy is because I'm fairly certain in my position and confident, and I've managed to build a community and, those sorts of things, right? And, I've family, friends. I have all the other ingredients for happiness, and I've come to certainty. Now, let's say that somebody like me hasn't managed to mix all those ingredients in the bowl. What's the strategy for somebody like that? And this is part of the reason that I do this channel, is because there aren't a lot of strategies for the people like that, for the people that are in that uncertain realm, the people that, can't hold their beliefs anymore, honestly. Like that, even if they wanted to, they couldn't tip the other way. They could maybe pretend, but it still wouldn't be real. Now, we don't have strategies built around those people. We don't have that. There is no counselor that they can go to that specializes in deconversion therapy. There's very few, if any, right? Because there's such a minute amount of research that's just kind of starting to take place and isn't really taking place that focuses on people in that situation. Now, people can speculate all they want about whether or not you would or would not be happy, or if you were or were not religious. However, there are people that currently are not and can't convince themselves to be, that are in those situations. And I think that it's better to kind of focus research around how to help them out, because I don't think just trying to convince them to convert back is going to do it. Does that make sense? Am I articulating that well from from a psychological perspective, given your
I think I get what you mean, and I want to go back to your last question in addition, because I feel like I didn't directly answer it.
You're right. Okay.
But with regard to what you just said, so I'll move backwards a little bit.
Sure. Yeah, I'm all over the place sometimes. Sorry.
No. I mean, because frankly, I think I didn't give a good answer, at least in terms of a direct answer, the first time you asked.
Okay.
Is with regard to your most recent thing, there are definitely benefits to, you could just say, like cognitive behavioral therapy, which is just, it's just like kind of you could say it's just thought conditioning. And by conditioning, I just mean like you're trying to get into good thought patterns. And that would be like true for anybody. That's like, regardless of where you are on the spectrum of theism to positive atheism, having positive thoughts is a healthy thing, and having too many negative thoughts is unhealthy. That influences your mood and can make you depressed. So one example of that would just be, sometimes we focus too much on the negative, or we don't take a balanced view of our own lives. And so we might focus so much on like, oh, well, this bad thing happened to me, and we're not counting our blessings, you might say. So definitely, I think that's a good thing. Like cognitive behavioral therapy is good for anybody, anywhere. And I see what you mean, where you're saying like, for some people, like they are at a state of which, like for whatever reason, maybe they feel like, I can't, they say I can't believe in religion, or I don't want to believe in religion or something. Well,
I don't even think it's necessarily a don't want. I don't think that's necessarily fair. I think a lot of people just, they can't,
Well, but
I think it's a choice.
You think that it could be both, though.
The don't want?
I mean, I would agree. Well, let's come back to this, because I don't want to neglect your first question.
Yeah, okay. We'll go way off the rails. We've only got like 25 minutes left before
we'll come right back to this one. We're coming back to this one. I don't know, to answer your question of whether or not somebody should believe in, so you said theoretically, if religious beliefs make you happy, should a person try to like work themselves back into being religious or something, or especially devoutly religious because they seem to be maybe the happiest?
Right.
I don't know. I haven't studied pragmatism a lot.
Mhm.
And so like I'd want to be more well-read in it before I took like a stance.
Sure.
So because before I had just mentioned there are degrees of pragmatism and I didn't really give you an answer. But for your question of whether or not there are people that maybe don't want to be religious. Well, I mean, here's an example. Like, I would be honest about the fact that, and this is like kind of relevant because we're in the same boat in one sense. Neither of us are Muslim, and
Right.
both of us think that our worldview is inconsistent with Islam. So I think so because I think Christianity is exclusive, namely that I think Jesus taught that he's the only way and that Muhammad's not an additional way you can also go while simultaneously following Jesus. Now, I understand there are different interpretations or denominations, so that's mine. And given if you grant mine, you see where it's coming from, you and I are in the same boat that we would both say neither of our worldviews is consistent with Islam, and I'm frankly quite happy because I enjoy pork. So
Me too, bacon. Yes, team bacon.
Yeah. So like, now is this a significant factor? No. I could give up pork and I could be a happy person. In fact, maybe I'd be happier.
I could not. No, bacon. Sorry, bacon.
So like,
that's my line. That's the hard line.
Yeah. So like, you could say that there are parts of religions that could theoretically, you could say the fact that I don't like, I mean, like I said, bacon's
but it's not the religion itself, it seems like, obviously, because when you held up that chart, it wasn't just Christians either, right? It was the ardent believers fell into, Jewish beliefs as well.
Yeah.
I think there was even Wiccans on there, right? So it had to do with the conviction of the belief, not with the specific religion as well. So that adds another level of complexity that we didn't really address. But it's fair to introduce when you're talking about if our goal is to have happier people, those convictions are result based on this research in happier people, irrespective of the denomination that they choose.
Yeah.
So should we just push people to whatever religion they feel like is best, or should we figure out what it is about those religions that might not be in that ingredient mix for some people who are atheist? Or could it be the fact that they deconverted? They may have been shunned, right? They may have lost people. They may have an unfavorable perception of them because they deconverted. They may have had to restructure their entire life. There's something also to be said for having to come out of a belief structure where you did have certainty. And now, to your perspective, I'm not going to say whether there's efficacy to this or not, but from your perspective, when you're coming out of it, that certainty is now gone. Now, do you even know what certainty is anymore? I mean, there's so many other components and facets that I think would feed into it. And this is why correlational data, I think, like, I'm enjoying talking about it, but a lot of this is Pearson R stuff, right? So
yeah, definitely. So there's a challenge in that some of our data that examines which religious groups are happier. In fact, I think all of the data I've seen on that question is correlational. Yeah. But there are studies that do test for differences. And we can talk about that in a second. And then we can also talk more importantly about the components of like, what is it though about one religion that makes it more happy facilitating, if it is not just a correlation, but an actual causal relationship.
Sure.
But I want to go back really quick because, I mean, I would say that a small part of me doesn't want to be Muslim. Now, I try to limit that bias because, like I said, Islam might be, I mean, for me, Ramadan's another example. Ramadan's like
eating.
A serious time of fasting that I would guess isn't very convenient. Like, especially, when I played football in college, one of the guys on our team was a Muslim who observed Ramadan. So he didn't have water the whole day during football practice. Like, so there's some like ways in which you could say that Islam would like, it, practically speaking, be less convenient for me. I'd have to make lifestyle changes.
Sure.
So I'm not saying that everybody is the same as me, but I would think that there are probably, like, every religion probably has some parts that wouldn't be convenient to us, and that therefore we may have like some psychological, it may be even to some degree subconscious, that reasons why we actually don't want to believe in certain religions. Now, we minimize those biases because we try to be as rational and fair and objective as we can. But I do think that it's true that that, now I'm not saying this is the case for all people, but you wouldn't maintain that, would you take the position that nobody has any sort of like kind of feelings of like, ooh, I'm not super excited if that religion is true because there are certain parts of my life that might have to change? Like, would you really say that there's nobody on the planet like that, or would you?
Oh, well, I think there's practical aversions for sure. So
okay.
I don't think to say that there's practical aversions is just true, obviously, right?
Yeah.
So I can understand how somebody wouldn't want to explore, who would choose if they were not in the religion. The religion is foreign to them for the most part, aside from, you know, sort of a tertiary understanding of the religion, would not want to explore whether or not it's true because of potential inconveniences. Now, if you're already in a religion, do I think that somebody would leave one because something is moderately inconvenient if they really believe it's true? Probably not.
Yeah, it seems like it would be
Not
like
if they really believe it's true, because then there's consequences involved, right?
Yeah, it seems like there's like this balance of like one can outweigh the other. If you believe for sure it's true, well, then you're going to be immune to the concerns of practical inconvenience, such as observing Ramadan or giving up pork. But if your belief is moderate or weak, and you really happen to like pork and really don't like Ramadan, well, then you could see how that maybe would have an influence in terms of, but I would say, more importantly, think about this. I think that you can have simultaneous like desires. So for example, like a person could be a strong believer in Islam, and yet deep down they kind of feel like that they kind of think, oh, like certain parts of this religion, whatever they may be, because there are more serious things than giving up pork or observing Ramadan.
Yeah.
They might simultaneously, but nonetheless, ignore thoughts of like why they don't. So, for example, like,
well, they'll comport and reinterpret, though. That's what tends to happen. You know, if you have an aversion to a certain component, in most religions, you know, that's why I think there's so many different denominations of so many different religions, like the Sunni and Shia. If we want to stick to the Muslim religion, based on the I believe it's the not the, oh my gosh, what are they called? It's not the Quran, the books that anyway. So but there's different denominations, because, you know, if somebody has an aversion to a certain portion of religion, there's always there, to a certain degree, they're malleable based on interpretation, right?
Yeah.
So until it can't bend anymore, like if you have so many aversions that are paramount to the tenets of that faith, if that's your reason for leaving, if your reason for leaving is, I really believe that this religion is true, however, is this the I want to sin argument? Is this what it's coming down to? The I want to sin, so I can't hold this belief anymore because that's more valuable to me. It seems like that's what you're getting towards. I think if you really believe that's true, you could rationally measure it out in your head. Like, it's a cost benefit analysis, right? Because there's, well, I suppose in Christianity, you can just sin, and then be like, forgive me, and then you're good. So maybe that's how people rationalize it. But
well, I think
don't know. I'm not quite sure what you're getting at, because I can see ways that people can rationalize their way into still believing in a lot of.
Well, it depends on something, though, doesn't it? It depends on if you believe those are reconcilable. Because if you have an unshakable belief that these things aren't reconcilable, so for example,
Okay.
Like, let's say you just, and like from what it sounds like, from what I gather, from what I've been hearing from you, you think that maybe beliefs are just not up to you. That it's just like you can't choose your beliefs. So if you happen to, let's say, if you have a firm belief that Allah really said you can't have pork and that you have to observe Ramadan, and you say if it's something different from that, well, then it's not Islam. If that's your view, if those are your beliefs, then that's what it ultimately depends on, regarding whether or not you can like split off and make a Muslim denomination that says that it's now okay to eat pork and ignore Ramadan. So I would say it depends. That's the broad answer, is that I do think that that gives an example of ways in which a person may not want a religion to be true. So I mean, I'm willing to admit that. Like, I don't see why. Like, so if I can admit,
you can not want something to be true, but that doesn't affect your opinion on whether or not it is.
well, hold on. I think that you're right. You don't have to let it affect your opinion. You can still be unbiased in the sense that you try to not let that influence you. So, for example, if I want to give Islam an objective look, I might know in the back of my mind that it would be a practical inconvenience to my life. But it doesn't mean that therefore I'm biased simply because I have these human desires of eating pork and not doing Ramadan. So my point isn't to say that like atheists are inherently biased or likewise, my point isn't to try to say that I'm inherently biased just because I would find components of Islam to be inconvenient to my life. My only point is that like, I do think it's true that not just non-religious people, but me too, I'm a religious person. And there are parts of me that say, yeah, I'd rather it not be the case that certain religions are true.
But you're still a Christian though. Like, even if there was components of your Christianity that you were like, oh, I don't like giving stuff up for Lent, right?
Oh yeah, I agree with you.
You're not going to go, you know what? I dislike that enough that screw it. Not a Christian anymore. I'm throwing it out the window. I don't like that I have to give things up for Lent. I really wish that I could swear more often, and I want to be more selfish. So you know what, God? Done. I'm done because you believe it's true.
Right. We're in agreement on that, because remember we talked about it depends on your degree of belief in.
Well, because you're an ardent believer. You're on the. So what you're saying is because you're on the strong end of the spectrum, your beliefs are stronger. So does that mean that you have more control over the things that you believe, or it's just because your belief strong because you have control over that? Because that's what we're talking about, right? Whether or not you can make a conscious choice to flick that switch based on external variables that you dislike, or maybe I'm misunderstanding the discussion a little bit.
No, my only point is that, so I mean, it sounds like we agree that a person could have reasons for not wanting a religion to be true.
Yes. Sure.
And then, so you might say practical inconvenience.
Yes.
And then we talked before about how a person could simultaneously believe in a religion and also maybe have desires to do things that are forbidden from that religion. But like you had said, if they believe strongly in the religion, they'll stick with it.
Right.
And part of that isn't just that they believe the religion, but they maybe believe that, some people will say, I believe it's conceptually possible that Islam could be true while allowing pork. So I'm going to split off and make my own denomination and it'll allow pork. But then there are others that I don't know if that's going to work, because as you had said, they can't control their beliefs. And if they happen to believe that, hey, Islam just says no pork, that's just the way it is for Islam. Well, then depending on different factors, they might stick with it, even though, so in other words, they might still be a devout Muslim, even though they simultaneously really wish they could eat pork. I mean, that doesn't seem conceptually impossible to have those, you could say, simultaneous diverging desires.
Right. Both those scenarios are fully plausible to me. I'm in agreement.
Yeah. So we agree on that. Like, there's no disagreement on any of these issues. I think it's more that you could say, just ironing out the wrinkles and kind of making sure we see where the other person stands. No, so I mean, sorry, I've been talking a lot.
That's totally fine. No, I'm on this channel all the time. Please go ahead.
Okay, so
I'm enjoying talking to you, by the way. I'm enjoying. I never get to talk to other people who study psychology, so this is delightful.
Oh, cool. Thanks. I appreciate that. This has been fun for me too. This is like one of those. There's three foundations of happiness. There's meaning. There's pleasure in the sense of like, oh, that piece of chocolate was great. And then the third one is flow, which is basically when you do something you really enjoy, and you're kind of like sucked into the moment. You forget everything bad in your life that's going on. Like this is like one of those things for me is these conversations I really enjoy. And it sounds like it is
a great debate community, by the way. You would have a lot of fun there.
Oh, that'd be fun. Yeah, I'd enjoy that. I'll write that down.
The great debate community. Yeah, you should really look up Steve McRae's channel or look up Steve. I'll tag you with Steve McRae on Twitter. You would have these conversations a lot more. Yeah, you should.
That's cool.
Do it. Yeah.
I'd enjoy that. Yeah, that sounds good.
Too. Everybody go check out the Great Debate Community. Anyway, sorry, keep going, James. I'm sorry. I derailed you.
Right.
But I'm enjoying chatting with you. You're fun to talk to.
Thanks. Let's see. So with regard to the question of which religion makes you happier, there are studies that do compare. And you might find it convenient for me to say this as a Christian.
Look at the smile. That was telling, body language.
No, here's really interesting. I haven't looked at all the data, and I haven't looked at this in a comprehensive way. Like I haven't looked at as many articles as I could.
Sure.
And I'm not even, so I'm saying I've just skimmed the surface, but it does look like Christianity may be, it facilitates, if it's not just correlational, we'll just stick with that. It has a stronger positive correlation with happiness compared to the other religions.
Okay.
We don't know if it's causal.
Based on demographics from where? The United States?
Globally speaking.
Globally? Okay, cool.
Yeah, so if I think there was a study that, and I can, if somebody wants this, let me know. I can find the study name. I can't remember it, but I promise I'm willing to look up the article if somebody wants.
Send it to me. I'll put it in the video description. I'd actually really like to read it just in general. If you can just take your time.
And this is an interesting article because they were looking at life satisfaction, and they said, let's look at which countries are the happiest out of 52, and let's look at what things correlate with happiness in these countries.
Okay.
And they had found, they weren't even looking for it. It was just like a post hoc type of like, oh, hey, well, we might as well test religion. It wasn't in their initial hypotheses that they had nonetheless found that Christianity correlated with happiness. So that was with 52 countries. And that's why the danger is some people make the mistake of, so for example, if somebody says, look, America's at least people in America say that they're like strongly Christian, and America happens to give a lot of foreign aid. And it's true that both in a personal, individual sense, Americans are more charitable. That there is data for that. And then there is data as well for the idea that the American government does give more. This is like, we can talk about which studies talk about this, because I know that some people find this controversial, and that's fine. That the American government does give more to charity, globally speaking. Now, if you want to debate that, that's fine. We can talk about that another time. But my point is, if someone says, "Oh, look, Americans are generally more Christian compared to many other countries, and they're also more generous," the problem with that is that, well, that's like obviously a really small sample of one. You'd want to have way more than that. You'd want to have way more than 5 as well. You want to have 50, or I mean, ideally 20 is usually like a standard number for a sample. But it nonetheless is up for debate whether or not this Christianity and happiness correlation is causal rather than just correlational, because Christianity may correlate with other societal things.
These societies could be predominantly Christian, but could also be governmentally secular, and could also, in these countries, there could potentially be more overall prosperity and, sort of existential security.
Yeah.
Based on the country itself having a higher degree of stability, but the religion of that country could be predominantly Christian. That could be how most people identify.
Right.
I mean, that's the issue with correlational data, because somebody else will hear something like that and post it or do a YouTube video going, "See, being a Christian makes you happy. They did a study that says Christianity makes you happy. Being a Christian is what makes you happy. They did a study."
Right.
When there's other factors, which is why we need to be careful when we're having these types of conversations, because there are people like me, people who are atheists, who are like, "Oh," right, or other denominations who read into that.
Right.
These things affect people, especially when we're discussing them in a public forum. And I think that it's worth mentioning, and it merits discussion, that unless we have it to present here right now, which I would happily put it in the video description, to posit what that means without looking at the methodology and looking at the other extraneous variables that could go into it, might be, I don't know. I mean, and I say that fully conceding that could be absolutely the cause.
Yeah.
It could, whatever, you could speculate whatever, and it could I could concede that it could absolutely be the cause, but we can't know without looking at it.
Yeah, I mean, I think that you get closer. You can't draw it with certainty the way you can with an experiment, but the more variables you control, you can at least get closer. You can increase your probability that it is Christianity that causes it.
Did they use those types of controls? Like, did they take out, for example, let's look at like social class, like, median income in the home, education. Like, did they weed out those things, or did they break them down?
I can't remember for sure, but I think they controlled for like the most obvious ones. So like, for example, like income would be one that you definitely want to control for.
Yeah.
But I don't remember the extent. It's certainly, the paper by itself isn't, I wouldn't, even from what I can remember from reading it quite a while ago, it's not a good reason to believe that Christianity causes happiness. But I'm just saying, as a methodological type deal, theoretically, if you control enough relevant variables, you can get closer. You could say your probability for thinking that it is causal can increase the more control you have over those variables that you think might be
contributing to happiness.
Yes, exactly. Now, and that's what economists oftentimes have to do, because behavioral economics is great. You can do things like the public goods game in an experimental setting, and you can draw causal explanations. But a lot of times economists, they're only left with correlational data, and what they have to do in a lot of these cases, especially if it's an ethical thing, because there's just some things you couldn't do to people in an experiment because it would be considered immoral.
Be an atheist. You're a Christian now. Tell me how you feel.
It's psychology's terrible history, but so in that case, a lot of times economists just have to say, well, we're going to try to compare, or we're going to try to control as many variables as we can, so we can at least have some sort of like higher probability of saying that there's actual causality going here. But there's more than one study that does compare Christians to other religions. And I think in America, though, it might be, I know there's at least one study. Well, sometimes they find, I think, the Amish are, I think, maybe the happiest in some studies. I think that in some studies they've been found, and I think sometimes Orthodox Jews have been found as the most happy. So it's like, ideally, I had a friend recently that had said, well, if the studies conflict, I guess we just we just don't know. And it's like, well, the ideal is you find a meta-analysis. You find one that it combines all the data, and it does a statistical analysis while giving in, I should say, including factors like all the participants and stuff like that. But I don't want to
variables pop out too when you do a meta-analysis. You see things that you weren't necessarily even looking for in the statistical trends.
Yeah.
Right? Like, other things will pop out that you hadn't even considered as maybe having a causal relationship.
Yeah.
Right? Like I love meta-analysis. My whole channel is meta-analysis lately. Cool. It's compiling as much. You said you had to go now. Do you still have more time, or do you have to go? I want to respect your time.
Well, I've been talking a lot, so I want to hear some of your like thoughts. If you had any more thoughts on these ideas, and then I should probably go. Sorry about that, but
No,
because I
it's
want to keep
okay.
doing this. This has been really fun. We should do it again.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. I
Yeah.
can come on your channel too if you'd like.
Oh
We
yeah, that'd be fun.
Yeah,
Yeah,
absolutely.
for real.
Do it again
I'm
here.
dead serious. So, yeah, if you have any last thoughts, and like I'd love to hear them because this has been really fun for me to get to listen. And like I said, sometimes I babble. So,
Me too. We're a good pair, you and I.
yeah. So,
Go off on tangents. I
but
love that.
well, I should add, I'll try to put the ball back in your court
Okay,
in terms of asking like one or two of the questions you asked me in terms of like
please do.
whether or not you're a pragmatist in terms of belief and like where would you draw the line? Would you say, and not just, it sounds like you'd agree that in extreme cases, like if religion were theoretically the only thing that pulled somebody out of suicide or something,
Right.
but would you even be more moderate? Like, would you say like, I don't know. I mean, like, some might argue that decision theory, well, go ahead. I want you to answer. Sorry.
Okay, so I think that you can obviously that it's possible to coerce people, obviously, but that's never an ethical choice. Coercing is never an ethical choice.
Right.
Now, I think if you really believe something is true, there's no moral downfall to professing why you believe it's true. Like well, obviously I'm an atheist. I I wouldn't be an atheist if I didn't believe that that was, the accurate position any more than you wouldn't be a Christian if you didn't believe that that was the accurate position. That doesn't make either of us any more right than the other. But I don't think there's anything wrong with either of us professing why we think that. Now, if somebody is convinced or compelled by what either of us say, sure, fine. But they were compelled because of something that happened in them, right? I don't think that you have a choice of like I as far as I'm concerned, my conversion was involuntary, or my deconversion was completely involuntary. It didn't happen because I made an active choice that I do not want to be a theist anymore. It happened because I could no longer hold that position honestly, based on things that I had learned and questions that I had that couldn't be answered and still can't. Those types of things. I couldn't honestly hold that position anymore, and that didn't happen because of me. That happened to me, and I think that's the case in most instances. And I haven't found one where it isn't. So if that's what you're asking, is whether or not we have control over the things that we believe, I think we have control over the things that we expose ourselves to. So I could put myself in a position, for example, where I'm just surrounded by delightful theists who are giving me compelling reasons to believe. And maybe that would compel me. But if it does, that's still not my choice. Or I could choose to put myself in a position where I'm surrounded by nothing but atheists who are going to reinforce my reasons to not believe. Now that's likely to keep me in it potentially, and not likely to give me reason to compel myself otherwise, which is why I make the choice to talk to theists, because I want to challenge my beliefs. But either way, it's not my choice what ultimately flicks or does not flick that switch. Right? I have the choice of what situations I'm going to be in,
Right.
but the effect that that situation has upon me isn't ultimately my choice. Did I articulate
I see
that
what you're
well?
saying. Yeah, yeah. I think I get what you're saying. Yeah, and well, like I get what you're saying in terms of those types of things. And
Mhm.
like, let's say, and you might not like theoretical questions, and
Oh,
that's
all
fine.
right. Let's do it. Let's mind
So
get.
like if you did, let's say, if you did have, let's say people, and this is theoretical,
Mhm.
if they did have full ability to believe what they wanted to, like without any sort of restraint or any sort of like
You could just
thing
decide
that's
tomorrow that you're not a Christian, just because.
like in that case, would you think it was good or smart to endorse a certain belief because it makes you more happy? Like if you like
Not
theoretically,
unless I knew 100% why. I would need to know. I would need to have a very high degree of certainty as to why that
hmm,
makes you happy, because it can also do a lot of other things. I mean, you would even admit that they're like the Jehovah's Witnesses and Mormons would consider themselves Christians, but they can do a lot of damage to people, right? And there's
um,
variability in the degree
I agree that religion can have bad effects. Yeah.
Religion can have bad effects, right? So
yeah, I think
pushing people towards something that potentially has bad effects, just because there's a strong degree of probability that based on a correlation, the people that really, 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 really believe in it are happier is negligent. I think.
I think I see what you're saying. So you're saying
because you could be pushing them towards the bad effect. You don't know, and you don't know how strong their belief is going to be, even if you do get them over that line. If you can flip that switch, you would also have to have control over how ardently they believe.
Yeah, I think go ahead. Sorry.
No, I think I got enough out that my position's relatively clear. So yeah, go ahead, please.
I think I get what you're saying. So I'll just try to like restate what I think I understood, and you can tell me if I'm wrong.
Okay.
I think you're saying if we know, and so the first thing is we do a cost-benefit analysis.
Sure.
If the harm from that belief outweighs the good that comes out of it, well, then obviously you don't do it. Like, right. And then you're saying another factor would be we also want to know if it even makes sense to waste our time trying to change so we want to know, is it actually true that religion X increases happiness? Because if I don't know that there's actually a causal relationship rather than just a correlation, why would I waste my time trying to change my belief?
And there's a third component as well. Also, what effect does it have dramatically shifting your belief system? There's a pardon me. There's an effect to dramatically shifting your belief system. It's intrinsic in your identity and also your perceptions. Right?
Yeah.
How you take an input and decide what output is going to come from that input has a lot to do with how you view the world. And how you view the world has a lot to do with your in-groups and has a lot to do with your identity. And an intrinsic part of that is your religious and or no religious affiliation. Now, if you're flicking that switch, things have to change. That has an effect as well. So what's the effect of that? What is the effect of that? What is the effect of flicking that switch? Is that interim period during that transition? Like it isn't just okay, I'm done. I don't believe anymore. Everything else is the same.
Right.
Or I do believe now and everything else is the same. There's a transition that takes place and that has an effect as well. So it's not just where you're going. It's how you get there.
Yeah,
like,
definitely.
Even in the theoretical, that has to take into we're talking about human people with brains.
Yeah.
That's an important consideration as well. What effect does that have on a person switching their belief system?
Yeah. Yeah, that's and
there's some evidence that not a great one.
I see what you're saying, that you'd have to like factor in the journey as well. Yeah.
Right? Is that fair, do you think?
I see what you're saying. Yeah, like that makes sense in terms of like from like a decision theory perspective, you'd like have to include that as part of your like decision making.
Especially if the goal is ardent belief, like being one of those high adherents. Like
right. Yeah.
It doesn't happen overnight.
Yeah.
There's steps to take to get to that.
Right. Yeah, I see what you're saying. Yeah, and then, like I said, from a decision theory perspective, which I'm a decision theorist, like I think decision theory is awesome.
I'd love to hear more about that. I'm going to start reading on it. I'm going to write that.
Yeah, that's great. It's like you should, from a decision theory perspective, that's something you'd include in your utility calculus. So that's good. But yeah, I should.
You have to go. I know, this is just getting super interesting. Okay, well, thanks to the chat.
Thanks. Yeah, it's fun.
His link is in the description. Go check out his channel. And thank you for coming, Chad.
Yeah,
sorry I wasn't interacting much. Paul was my proxy. Paul, I hope you were being nice to the chat. All right, James, say bye to everyone.
Thank you. Goodbye. I appreciate it.
Bye, guys.
Take care.